And what we have planned to talk to is, first of all, why is nature relevant for businesses? Then we will talk about the nature reporting landscape that many of you may already be working with. How can you get started with nature reporting? And then we want to share some examples of nature positive leadership in practice. And like every time we host these webinars, we also welcome questions. So there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions through the online function. If we do not manage to respond to all of them, we will follow up with you. And we may also take a couple of questions as we go if they are particularly relevant to the section we are going through. So thankfully, I am not alone. I am joined here by my good colleagues who are the real experts. First of all, Erlend Bjørklund, who is joining us from PwC in Norway. Welcome very much to this webinar. And then my colleague here in Denmark, Annette Schøtfig, who is leading our work here in Denmark with nature positive business. So welcome to both of you, and welcome to everyone who's joining this webinar. So first of all, let's just set the stage, because we know going back to the 2015 seminal Sustainable Development Goals, how businesses have been adopting sustainability into their strategies, not just to be responsible businesses, but indeed also to secure their long-term business resilience. And there is a focus on safeguarding nature embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals. We also have, with the IPCC reports and the Paris Agreement, a global commitment to a net zero that many companies have now subscribed to, and the nature agenda, which is not quite as advanced yet, is following in that track. So we will come back to that in a moment. What is important also to remind us of is the fact that the net zero is something that needs to be accomplished with also a just transition, so ensuring that we have a balanced development in which we consider how we can avoid leaving anyone behind. We have the European Green Deal, and with that also the host of regulation, out of which, importantly in this context, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD as it's called by friends, has been implemented to guide companies on how they can go about it and how they can contribute to the achievement of the very ambitious goals that were set by the European Green Deal, again, for Europe to be competitive and sustainable. And all of this is also carrying into what is the topic of this webinar, namely nature, where we have the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. That is a really helpful framework for understanding how you set up your governance, your strategy, how you manage your risks, and how you report on your performance. So all of this is really the backdrop of what we will be talking about today. A few weeks ago, we had the COP16 meeting in Cali with a theme around how we can catalyze global action for nature's future. And coming back to the fact that nature is playing a catch-up game with the climate agenda, so we need to make sure that we accelerate action on behalf of nature. So the 5 themes we have listed here, and what is worthwhile mentioning here is that the outcome was a bit mixed, it's fair to say. There's progress indeed, but there are also continuing challenges. And in particular, the focus on how can we ensure that we have inclusive participation, that we have funding mechanisms, and also that all of the nations that are contributing to the COP negotiations and to the actions, that they are held accountable. So we still need to put resources, efforts behind the implementation of the global biodiversity framework and to achieve the biodiversity goals within the next 6 years. 6 years is a long time. And the message from us here is that it's time for action. It really is time to get into the weeds. So with that, I want to hand over to you, Alan, and ask you, so why is nature relevant from a business context?
Thank you so much, and thanks for that overview of the backdrop. I really resonate with what you said. This is the time for action, so it's time to get into the weeds. But I really want to just start off with a little bit of kind of definitions to orient the discussion. And I think when people think of nature, they really think of the natural world around us, and that is completely correct. It's the air we breathe, it's the water we drink, and it's the resources that enable our companies to actually thrive. But because that's such a big catch-all phrase, we also have to be able to address the complexities of nature in a slightly more nuanced way. So one way of doing that is to understand the so-called hierarchy of biodiversity and ecosystems. So it's presented here visually in a slide. And really what it all comes down to is all the way down at the genetic level. Nature can be broken down at a very micro scale, at a genetic level, which can then scale up into various forms of species. That's where we're introduced to various types of bacteria, plants, fungi, insects, fish, you name it. Now, when these species scale further up into the hierarchy, you're left with populations. Populations intermingle to form communities, and these communities then reside in specific ecosystems. And these ecosystems, broadly speaking, can be categorized into three. So either a freshwater ecosystem, a terrestrial or land-based ecosystem, or a marine ecosystem. And when you patch these various ecosystems together, you're left with a biome. We have distinct biomes here on Earth, and we have one biosphere that kind of wraps everything together in our collective and shared biosphere. So when you're really asking about, yes, nature is the air we breathe and the water we drink and everything else, but you can really also break it down into this hierarchy and furthermore even understand that biodiversity and its complexities can also be understood by understanding the variation in genetic and functional attributes across this hierarchy, and also the changes in abundance and distribution over time and space across this hierarchy. So it's kind of like understanding this illustration both on an x-axis, but also on a y-axis. With that being said, we can move away from definitions and, seems my clicker here. Oh, there we go. We can move away from definitions and actually start addressing the state of nature. So I think the really essential starting point here is to state that nature provides society and businesses, fairly free of charge actually, essential services and forms of natural capital that enable us to thrive. But that natural capital and those ecosystem services are being lost at an unprecedented rate. In the last 50 years alone, we've seen a decline of more than 70% in world wildlife. We also have around 1 million species that are currently at the risk of extinction. So we are seeing a rapid loss of nature. The natural world is declining at an alarming rate. And why does this matter for the economy? As I've mentioned, nature provides services and natural capital to businesses, but a PwC analysis actually shows that more than half of the world's economy is moderately to highly dependent on nature. Certain sectors that are extractive, for example, are inherently more reliant on nature, and those industries together actually create an economic value of around $58 trillion. And nature is also an essential for combating climate change. Today's webinar will be about nature, but I think it's important to address that these are two sides of the same coin. and there is no net zero without nature. Nature actually provides up to 37% of mitigation solutions through so-called nature-based solutions. So we really need nature on our side in order to combat climate change. And just to kind of really bring it home one more time for the economic value or kind of the business case of conserving nature, then you can actually start quantifying what nature actually provides in economic value. And this is a really difficult and pretty abstract task. But according to one initiative called the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, then it has been estimated that nature provides an economic value every single year of $150 trillion US. Just to put that into context, that's 10 times larger than the US economy. So everybody refers to the US as the world's largest economy, but in fact, nature is the world's largest economy, and it is sadly in a bit of a recession. So moving on, we've talked about the definitions of nature, we've talked about the value of nature, and we've talked about the state of its decline. Now, let's address the drivers behind that decline. And this is really about understanding the 5 leading so-called impact drivers. These impact drivers are defined by the equivalent of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We have the same thing for nature called the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And they have determined 5 leading causes: land use change, climate change, pollution, invasive species, and direct exploitation of natural capital. Those are the 5 leading drivers, and I want to spend a little bit of time on 2 of them. So starting off with climate change, this is also just to drive home the point that climate and nature truly are 2 sides of the same coin. This is a dual crisis that needs to be addressed together, because if we don't address the nature crisis, then we will see a worsening effect on the climate side and vice versa. So just to illustrate this, you can start seeing projected losses in nature if we fail to meet our climate targets. So for example, if we are, in a best case scenario, we are able to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, then you will still see a degradation in ecosystems, populations of insects and fisheries. However, with just half a degree, then these projected losses will dramatically increase. So for example, in the case of ecosystems, the projected loss is twice as bad, essentially increasing to 13% of land area, where ecosystems will shift to a new biome. For insects, it's roughly 3 times as bad with just half a degree of warming, meaning that almost 20% of insects will lose their ecosystem range. And for fisheries, it's also roughly twice as bad with just 1/2 of degree of warming, where we'll see 3 million tons of fisheries declining in a 2-degree scenario. So again, climate, nature, 2 sides of the same coin, really need to be addressed together, as climate is both a driver of loss of nature, but also losing nature will also actually undercut our ability to mitigate climate change. Now, the second driver that I want to spend the time on is the most important, and this is land use change. Land use change, out of all of the 5 impact drivers I've discussed, is by far the leading cause of nature loss. And there's one dramatic fact that I really want to raise here to kind of illustrate just how this land use change is such a big driver. And that's that in 2020, for the first time in our human history, we saw a tipping point. The planet saw a tipping point where man-made mass, so all of our clothes, our roads, bridges, iPhones, you name it, all of that together weighs more than the world's nature combined. So the world's nature, defined as the world's biomass, so all of the trees, all of the plants, elephants, dolphins, you name it, all of that mass together is less than human-made mass. As we take from nature and we turn it into human-made mass, we are kind of gradually tipping the scales. And in 2020, for the first time, we saw then more so-called anthropomass than biomass. And if we continue at this pace, human-made mass will actually be 3 times larger than biomass by 2040. So land use change, taking land and or taking natural resources and turning it into something else, by far the leading cause of nature loss, and it is progressing at a pretty alarming pace. And luckily, business leaders are not completely oblivious to this. We are increasingly becoming aware of the risks associated to the nature crisis. So every single year, the World Economic Forum collects a large survey from business leaders and asks them about their risk horizons. And the 2024 risk report shows that business leaders actually had environmental or nature-related risks as 5 of the top 10 risks on a 10-year horizon. So we are very aware of the fact that this situation that we find ourselves in is a serious risk to our businesses. However, when asked the same question for a 2-year time horizon, nature-related risks actually were only 2 out of the top 5. So business leaders are aware of the fact that this is causing risks, but we might not be as aware of the immediacy of this issue as we are kind of largely considering this to be a more long-term risk. Food for thought. So with that, I think I'll hand it over to my colleague Annette.
Indeed.
Thank you.
And now on to something closely related, slightly different.
Biodiversity. Many corporate strategies. However, driven by a growing interest in the financial sector, this is changing. Investors are recognizing that biodiversity loss carry significant economic cost and risk to organizations. Regulators, especially within Europe, are raising expectations for corporate transparency on ESG impact. With framework like Susanne already mentioned, CSRD, companies are facing strengthened reporting standard on climate impacts, biodiversity, and social responsibility. The implications for companies is also that employees are starting actually to question what are the purpose of the organization and do the organization prioritize ESG when it comes to the culture and the way it operates. Companies are therefore now expected to go beyond the traditional profit-driven goals and address those concerns. Across sectors, companies have already incurred losses of billions of euros due to physical risk, such as declining access to groundwater and legal and reputational risk due to illegal pollutions and deforestation. New regulation and frameworks like the CSRD, TNFD are driving corporate action to protect nature. The nature-related reporting landscape under CSRD focus on enhancing transparency regarding companies' impact and dependencies on ecosystem, biodiversity, and natural resources. The primary goal is to align companies with the European Union's environmental objectives, especially in the context of the European Green Deal. The ESRS includes 5 standards particularly relevant to nature, and I say 5 because E1 is also to be taken into consideration as climate change is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss. Others are the E2, requiring companies to collect data related to pollution levels in air, water, soil, also including microplastics. E3 focusing on the company's impact and managed risk related to water and marine resources, and then E4 is specifically dedicated to biodiversity and ecosystems, requiring companies to report on their dependencies on nature ecosystems and their impact on biodiversity. Key areas include ecosystem degradation, deforestation, and protection and restoring of biodiversity across the value chain. And finally, We also have E5, resources used and circular economy. These standards emphasize the need to report on both risks and opportunity, the impacts across with nature, covering both direct and indirect impacts. Target setting initiatives like the SBTN and new biodiversity reporting standard from the Global Reporting Initiative further to support the development. And how do we then get started with the nature reporting? We have the E4 standard, which mandate a structured approach for companies to address biodiversity and ecosystem consideration with their business activity, supply chain, and value chain. By requiring a thorough analysis and transparent reporting on biodiversity impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities, E4 aligns company with the EU biodiversity objective and equips stakeholders with critical information on environmental stewardship. I know we're now talking regarding reporting, but this is more than just compliance exercise. It can also help companies to strengthen their resilience and identify new opportunities. All these standards have the same architecture and is around those 4 pillars up here: the governance, the strategy, the IRO management, and the measures and targets. The identification and assessment impacts and dependencies on biodiversity. Companies must conduct an assessment on how the operation impact the biodiversity and ecosystems. This includes identifying negative impacts like habitat loss, pollution, and contribute to the biodiversity losses. When we then move into the next slide, when conducting the double materiality analysis on the E4, the CSD recommends to follow the LEAP approach, and Erland will touch on that later in the presentation. The LEAP approach provides a structured framework for companies to understand and disclose the impact and dependencies on nature, which directly supports the double materiality assessment. The latest science tells us about 25% of our assessed plant and animal species are threatened by human actions. The United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative is a partnership between the United Nations Environmental Programme and the global finance sector to catalyze action across the financial system to align economics with sustainable development. It focuses on high dependencies and high impact sectors as priorities for the initial actions. Nature-related risks to business take many forms, and they cannot be addressed through a single lens. The 2 key factors need to be considered when looking at these risks at the level of individual organization: their dependencies on nature and their impact on nature. Organizations depend on nature either directly or through their supply chain. An example could be a water utility company directly dependent on the continued provision of water. Another one could be a food retail company dependent indirectly on natural processes such as climate regulation, which are important for the production of food crops. Similarly, organizations directly or indirectly impact on nature. These impacts can either be negative or positive. The table included on the slide provide an overview of main dependencies and impact. However, organizations depend on ecosystem services to operate. Example, forests provide wood For timber producers and growers depend upon insects and birds to pollinate crops. These dependencies can present physical risk to business operation, manifesting through degradations of nature and the resulting loss of ecosystem services. Physical natural risks are either acute or chronic, broadly referring to short and long-term nature-related events. Companies also impact nature through their operations. When these production processes are misaligned with the changing regulation, market dynamics, or community expectation, the business becomes exposed to transition risks that can lead to financial cost. Impact and dependencies on nature can spread via the entire natural economic system, hitting tipping points, creating systemic risk for companies. Companies that fail to address interconnected risk may face supply chain disruption and rising costs. Factors like these risk into the company's strategy is therefore essential to make sure that they are resilient. Erlend will share more on this in the next point, where he talks about the nature positive leadership in practice.
And maybe just before handing over to you, Erlend, we've had a question because you talked about the human obesity crisis, if I heard you correctly, the fact that human material is now by far outweighing the natural. We also talked about the cost of nature that we are not currently paying for. So the question is, can we still have economic growth and still protect nature? And if yes, how is that possible with increasing consumption? So if you bear that in mind and relate to that, I'm sure that our listener will pay particular attention to what you're saying.
Sure. I can just start by maybe saying that that is a pretty theoretical question. Obviously, our current economic model today is a linear economic model. We produce for every extra unit of some kind of good produced, it is a linear economic model. And I think that the key to both preserving the natural world while also maintaining some of the material goods that we have today, a part of the solution lies within the circular economy, taking more resources and actually breaking that linear cycle and making it more a sustainable and circular loop. And the other side of it is actually what we'll be talking about next, which is what we call so-called nature positive leadership in practice. We've spent a little bit of time today talking about the definitions, the problems, and the drivers behind it. And we've also heard Annette talk about how certain regulations are coming, especially on the reporting side, to get companies to start addressing some of their nature-related impacts, risks, opportunities, and dependencies. But we were essentially asked by your Scandinavian neighbor in Norway to essentially take the same question that was just posed and then create a framework for how to actually both create economic growth, but also preserve the natural world as much as we can. So we started off by asking, what is a nature positive transition? What does it actually mean to move away from the problem that we've defined today towards a future that is more, at the very least, in a vague setting, nature positive? But to really define it to a more specific degree, at least, we define a nature positive transition as a societal transition where companies operate within scientifically defined planetary boundaries. Some of you might be familiar with the term planetary boundaries, but it's again going back to that hierarchy in the beginning of the webinar, talking about how can we actually thrive on this planet, but maintaining a certain stability as we are all sharing the same biosphere. But essentially, we define it as a transition where companies operate within these boundaries, and it is accomplished pure and simply by stopping and reversing the loss of nature. Now, that's easier said than done, we know, but we see that the current decline of nature needs to first be stopped and then be reversed so that we can actually go into a more net positive future. So moving away from this kind of definition towards a more framework-oriented solution was the next task. But to really address this, we essentially wanted to understand what businesses needed. So in Norway, we sent out a survey to the largest companies in Norway. We got about 50 replies back from amongst the top 100 companies by revenue. And we asked, what do you need as a company to get started with this nature positive transition? And we got a lot of different answers, some of which were saying, we need an overview of sources. We need a starting point. We need a centralized source of insight. We need this and that. But the one common feedback that by far outweighed the rest was a practical guide, a practical tool that actually helped companies break down this problem and move and essentially attack the situation or attack the problem in a more systematic way. So that's why we took it to the next step by gathering 11 industry players in Norway as a reference group. And then we started actually addressing what could this practical toolkit look like. What we arrived at was a two-part solution. The first part, which is on the left side of your screen, is our 5-step approach for nature positive leadership. And we'll go through each of the steps in brief, but I also just want to say that the complementary part to our solution was a toolkit. So each of these steps have some kind of toolkit or aid resource to help companies get started and start the process of either addressing the reporting side of the questions, which we've talked about already, but also addressing this from a holistic perspective, seeing what type of opportunities you can capitalize on, and how this in turn will create a company that is more resilient in this nature positive transition. So if we start with the left side, the first step in our 5-step approach is to understand the status quo. Understand what exactly is your company's context within this drastic loss of nature. And what that really translates to is essentially understanding your nature risks, opportunities, and impacts and dependencies. In each of the steps, I also want to just bring your attention that we defined one key success criteria. And for this step, acknowledging the problem is essential to actually successfully addressing this first step. We will spend a little bit of time on the first step on the next slide, but I just want to walk through the whole 5-step approach first. So after you've understood the status quo, you've understood your risks and your opportunities, how you impact the natural world, and what types of dependencies you have, then you can move on to your actual ambitions. What is your company's ambition within the transition to a nature positive future? And the success criteria here is a so-called transition mindset. This is a pretty drastic change from current economic systems, from current linear business models, and having that innovative and transition mindset when you're actually talking about ambitions, which are inherently fairly long-term and more on that 10-year horizon, so to speak, then having that is a critical success criteria when defining your ambitions. We also recognize that not everybody can be industry leaders in this space, but having a transition mindset will help you understand how the current company model and your supply chain has to transition, given that there is an urgent need for this transition from a societal perspective. And once you've discussed ambitions, then you can get a little bit more detailed and move into the third step, where you start establishing targets and actions. And we explicitly combine targets and actions in this step together because we don't see any value of a target without an action plan, or an action plan without any kind of target to guide the companies forward. And the critical success criteria here is firm prioritization. Prioritization is key because this is not going to be an easy transition. Some targets will be harder than others. So prioritizing which targets and which actions are essentially give you the most bang for your buck will be essential for successfully transitioning towards a nature positive future, and doing so in a competitive way. So after you've talked about your ambitions, you've made it more specific by looking at targets, and you've determined actions to go along with them, then you can kind of formalize this in the fourth step, which is integrating an action plan into a specific company-specific way. So we're probably all familiar with strategic reviews, budgeting processes, and so on. That's really essentially taking these targets and actions and placing them within the company's existing way of doing things, the organizational structure, so to speak. How do we collectively move in the right direction and hit those milestones? And the success criteria here is being systematic and having that firm governance structure in place. I always like to say that both climate and nature is a team sport. You cannot succeed on your own. So a governance structure is really how you make sure that everybody is playing according to the same rules, so to speak, but also addressing those milestones in a collective fashion. And finally, when you're done with the 4 steps, you're maybe 4-5% through the process, because the 5th and final step is by far the most important and the most demanding. And that's when you actually start operationalizing some of these plans and really seeing those results. And the critical success criteria here is, again, change management and active monitoring. This is really where the transition happens every single day in practice. It might not be as it might not fit within this framework as neatly as the other steps, but that's really where the company-specific actions take form. Now, for each of these steps, as I mentioned, there is a complementary toolkit. So, for example, to get companies started, we've also provided an overview of nature risk per sector. We've also found the most important physical and transition risks for the 5 main ecosystems in Scandinavia, or at least in Norway, but I'm sure there's quite a lot of overlap with those ecosystems here in Denmark. We also created a template for the action plan. We also broke down 2 of the leading frameworks that have already been addressed today, being the TNFD's LEAP methodology and the Science-Based Target Network's methodology for setting targets. We've provided an overview of which open source sources you can pool and kind of use, created a list of terms and definitions, an overview of other existing frameworks, and we've embellished the results of this questionnaire that we sent out, as mentioned earlier. So together, we hope that this is a kind of a starting kit at the very least to catalyze a nature positive transition. And I want to move on by spending a little bit of time on the first step. And that's because we see the vast majority of companies, at least in Norway, but I'm assuming it's quite a similar situation here in Denmark. The vast majority of companies are still on step 1. They're still understanding the status quo. And this is really about understanding your risks, your opportunities, and impacts and dependencies, as mentioned. But to break it down, we have a further 5 steps that can make this quite specific. So the first step, similar to other frameworks, such as the LEAP framework, is to simply map your locations. Nature is a site-specific phenomenon. So, for example, if you have a production facility in Spain, there will be a different type of ecosystem around that compared to a critical supplier that is in Eastern China or something similar. So essentially, first, mapping your entire value chain, mapping the locations that you want to assess, is your most important first step. After you have this map, you can map the nature that resides on top of those locations, essentially collating these 2 maps together. Because when you have that understanding of what ecosystems and species are in the same location, you're able to move on to the next step, step 3, where you actually start looking at the site-specific impacts and dependencies related to those ecosystems, which are then in scope. A good tip here for companies who wish to start is to begin maybe at an industry level. Sometimes value chains look quite similar, so beginning from an industry level can be quite useful. And we also really recommend utilizing open source tools such as the World Wildlife Fund's Biodiversity Risk Filter, which is, at least to my knowledge, by far the most comprehensive open source tool that gets you started in this kind of map-based exercise. And when you understand site-specific impacts and dependencies, in combination, you will be made aware of your risks and opportunities, either at the site level, but also at a more aggregated corporate level. And that's step 4. And this will be a subjective assessment, where you actually look at both those external resources, but also internal sources that tell you a little bit about that site's resilience to certain risks or resilience to certain impacts. Maybe you have mitigating measures in place already that have to be taken into account. This allows you to arrive at an understanding of what the specific risks and opportunities are. And once you have that list in place, you can move on to the final step, which is prioritizing. You cannot necessarily analyze every single risk and opportunity that you have arrived at. So prioritization is key. And this is really where we employ the materiality concept, just as one does in, for example, a double materiality analysis and other frameworks. And materiality is not an exact science. For anyone who's been through a double materiality assessment, this is not something that is kind of plug and play, but we really urge you to use a few important principles to allow you to assess materiality. And that could be anything from economic magnitude of the risk or opportunity, the strategic importance of a site or an opportunity, the accuracy of the information, maybe the uncertainty of the information that you are relying on could help you prioritize either down or up. Expectations from stakeholders, there you're talking about maybe different jurisdictions and so on. And finally, how much company influence do you have over the given impact, risk, dependency, and so on? Is there certain, let's say, fixed parts, or are these actually movable parts? So this practically takes you through how you can understand your status quo. This approach, I should say, very much aligns with the TNFD's LEAP methodology. We just found a need to make it a little less theoretical and a little bit more straightforward, I suppose. So to wrap it up, I just wanted to present one example to illustrate this. And I think one thing that everybody has a relationship to is a car. So the automobile is a good example. It's also an extremely global supply chain where you're talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of individual components that together form this unified thing that most people either have or have a relationship to. So just like I said, the first step is to map locations and to map the ecosystems at that location. We can start by breaking this down into your upstream supply chain, your direct operations, and then your downstream supply chain. So taking the example of which raw materials are you dependent on when you're making a car. For example, suppliers obtain wood and rubber or renewable natural materials, whether it's leather and so on. So they're therefore dependent on provisioning services for those raw materials. Mining companies also use water to extract lithium, if in the case of an electric car, or other raw materials that you are dependent on to actually deliver this good. So that dependency poses a potential risk. Moving on, you can see in your direct operations, there's a bit of a company that manufactures vehicles. Here you're looking at automakers using water in various manufacturing processes. The question then becomes, is that manufacturing process creating an impact in the local environment? Is there a water discharge that is resulting in the form of pollution? Are you exposed to regulations against those discharges and so on? Does that potentially pose a risk? Is there a fine that could come into play here? These are the types of both physical and transition risks that could be at play in your direct operations. And then finally, in the downstream, looking at distribution and sales, car dealers are protected from floods by the stormwater absorbing function of nearby natural areas. So here, a car lot, for example, that relies on this landmass, the space to actually have its distribution channels. If you're relying on a flood wall or some kind of nature-based solution to protect you against natural hazards, that could be a dependency that could then in turn potentially pose a risk if this flood wall were to be diminished in some sort. So this just kind of illustrates how exactly we're looking at risks and opportunities across the entire value chain from raw materials to direct operations, and finally to the downstream distribution, and really seeing how the site-specific qualities or site-specific attributes of nature at a site level is what, together becomes your overall risk and opportunity exposure. So where does this leave us? We've talked about a lot today, but I think the most important thing is to get started. We get a lot of feedback from clients who tell us that maybe they're a little afraid to start the exercise because, especially now that these reporting requirements are coming, there's quite a lot to take into account. But we really need to stress the fact that we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And it's far better to get started because this is an exercise that needs maturing. We've had 5-10 years of work with climate to get to where we are today. And we don't necessarily have the same time to have that maturity curve for the nature side. So we really need to get started. Even if you start with a pilot, get started. That's the key point. Second off, involve and engage your stakeholders as early as possible. Just like I said, that climate and nature is not it's not a individual sport, it's a team sport. Engage your value chain, engage stakeholders, get your management team and your board to actually engage with these issues, because as we're talking about transformation, these are the stakeholders that really have decision-making power and who actually need to lead the way. And finally, share your knowledge and experience. Our 5-step approach and our toolkit is an example how we combined insights and feedback from 11 industry players to share feedback, share a starting point, but essentially catalyze a nature positive transition. But it's super important that every single company collaborate with partners and remember to leverage the entire value chain. And that's all I had for now.
Thank you so much, Erlend. And I think it's a great kickoff to actually now have a conversation with the two of you. And to your point about getting started, I would like to turn my attention to you, Annette, because you talked about how the regulatory framework can be a lever. So what are the potential regulatory changes that businesses should be aware of? That's one, and I think you have covered that. But then also building on that, what existing work can they leverage so that they can actually get started, as you say, Erlend, on this assessment of risk? So where do we begin?
Thank you. And I think here is actually where we see that it could benefit from starting with what many companies already have in their house, their enterprise risk management portfolio. Here, maybe they haven't had the full lens, but here they would have critical suppliers as one thing. And maybe it's just to put additional lenses in front of that and deep a little bit deeper into it, because many companies recognize the dependencies maybe to the first supplier, but going a little bit further into the whole supplier net, then many companies do not know yet. So actually understanding where are they located, what are some of the issues, and then I'm also sure that soon many companies will actually compete for some of the same raw materials out there which are more sustainable than others. So bringing those lenses on when you do your enterprise risk management, but build on what you already have today.
Right. That's a very good tip, very practical. And talking about stakeholders, so I would presume that suppliers would be one critical type of stakeholder. Who else would you want to engage in this team sport, Erlend?
At least based on our experience, I think the first stakeholder to really kind of start with a tone at the top is your management team. And that's essentially to prioritize this at the appropriate level. So even if that means, as I said, starting with a pilot, just having some kind of, okay, let's build off of what we already have, but we want to add a stakeholder engagement that makes it clear that this is priority. I would say that the first internal stakeholder is the management team. Now, this is also...
And are they reliable?
Well, that depends on the team, I suppose, but I think that it's an essential starting point at the very least. Another thing I want to add is that management teams will set the tone at the top in the sense of direction. They will make priorities clear, but this is a new and complex thematic area. So also engaging with expert communities or NGOs. Again, I mentioned that nature risk is highly site specific. So you'll also find that, at least in Norway, we find that some of these scientific kind of experts are also kind of site specific. It's a big difference if you have a production plant in a wetland versus on the top of a mountain, so to speak. So combining kind of tone at the top, a sense of direction with expert-led knowledge that enables you to get started, understand your status quo. I think those are the two, I guess, must-have stakeholder groups at the very least.
Yeah. Thank you. And we've had another question here, which is from an investor perspective. So now we've talked about what the companies must do, but we also know that investors need to protect their investments and to understand the risks associated with what are their financial activities. So here we have a question that goes like this. Is there somewhere a database, and I'm looking to you, Alan, or a tool that you can check where you see how much the extraction of a specific material contributes to biodiversity loss? So in other words, you have an investment, it's in this particular industry. How much of a damage to nature is that causing? Is there a place to go?
Yes, there's definitely a place to go. I have not seen something at the very specific product level. For example, one kilo of lithium, what does that actually pose from a nature perspective? We do have that for climate. There's a XAO base, which is pooling together life cycle assessments and so on. But I really want to go back to, again, the previous recommendation, which is the WWF's biodiversity risk filter. So here it's an open source map-based tool where you are able to basically create a portfolio where you select your sites. You actually geolocate them through coordinates, just like on Google Maps, and then you select your industry and what you're providing, and it gives you at least a starting point of what are your impacts at this site across various ecosystem services and so on, as well as what are your dependencies. So obviously, to get a really rich additional data to that, you would need to maybe ask the investee themselves. You need to ask, get more site-specific bottom-up information. But that's a fantastic kind of starting point, top-down place to start, I guess.
Right, and thank you very much for that tip. So here's one for you. The person who questioned or who asked the question is to follow Ellen's advice and go back and ask some of the deeper questions that you can engage with your investee about. Then, Annette, there's another question that asks, do you see synergies with other legislations? So we have CSDDD, we talked about the just transition, the European deforestation regulation, which of course is on a bumpy road. So use those in the longer supply chain to push forward the nature perspective. So what is your take on synergies with other regulations?
Of course, there is, right, because they build on one another. And I think what we are seeing right now is actually a landscape where a lot of alignment try to go on, but then there are small pockets of different things which are requested in those pieces of legislation. When the DDD comes, there will be a lot more questions to ask, but it builds on this foundation here. But there will be more lenses to put on.
And worth mentioning also that your framework is, as you also said, consistent with the European standards and the regulation there. So you have future-proofed it.
Yes.
From your perspective. So here's another question. So how can a company engage in a concrete off-site biodiversity project, and how can the company gain from it? So here we're talking about the potential benefits, and maybe I can ask you about that, Ellen. So getting into the positive business case.
So it's a great question, because I think we might have been a bit guilty of spending a little bit more time on the risk side, but I really want to support you there in saying that there are opportunities in this transition. And on the opportunity side, some of what we're seeing, at least, that can be really kind of when you're, I mean, as we defined the transition to be stopping and reversing the loss of nature, then the reversing side is essentially restoration. So at least, largely speaking, let's say there's a expansion project. A company wants to find a new site. Then they can actually select a site that is appropriate for restoration or has the opportunity for restoration. And we're actually seeing some business models form around this, where some of these restoration-based projects can actually be turned into biodiversity offset credits and sold. This is a very immature market, so we don't necessarily want to speak to the quality of this so on, but it really is just illustrating how there is economic gains in the restoration space. I think another easy example of the opportunity side is looking at just pure and simple resource efficiency. So the less resources you use, whether it's on-site or off-site, you will be saving money. So it's not just kind of gaining market share or providing a new nature positive product, but also just if you look at your existing portfolio, how can you make the same stuff with less stuff, right? That there's a cost saving element, and there's an opportunity in that as well. So I guess I provided one low-hanging fruit and one a little bit more on the innovative side to just illustrate the spectrum of opportunities here.
Right. So what you said in the beginning is we've been overspending for a long time from the nature budget of the earth.
Yes.
And now at least what we need to do is to go on a diet.
Yeah.
And also be a little bit stingy with our investments. Yes. and thinking about resource optimization in everything we do.
Exactly.
We don't have a lot of time to go into details, but I know that a couple of examples you would point to, if you could just mention, a couple of names of companies you can look up and see what they've been doing. Can you just?
Yeah, it's obviously a up for grabs market, but we recently saw 3 companies that decided to kind of be front runners, at least in the target setting side of things, who recently are the only 3 companies who have gotten their nature targets approved by SBTN, or the Science-Based Targets Network for Nature. One of them is Caring, the parent company of various luxury brands. And this really underscores how they are selling a luxury good. It is largely based on natural resources, raw materials from nature, and they want to provide this good and provide their entire business, but within those planetary boundaries. So I would say they're pretty early in the game. They've done really interesting work as well with so-called environmental profit and loss. So not just looking at P&L from a financial perspective, but also from an environmental perspective. There are a few other ones, GSK, the biopharma company, I believe it is, and one more company that I'm forgetting the name of right now, but it does illustrate that, look at the Science-Based Targets Network and start finding some good peers there.
And that's a wonderful segue, because we are indeed on time. And the next occasion for you to talk about nature with us is on 9th of January, where we are hosting a conference here at PwC. And in this conference, we will have quite a few really exciting Danish examples from companies and investors who are grappling with this and finding their solutions. So we still have a few seats. So please do sign up if you're interested in more, and otherwise you know where to find us. You will find our details in the deck. Thank you very much for listening, and get started. Thank you.